I like to go camping a lot, and my dog, Cooper, is usually with me when I do. Last year, I went camping to a spot where I had never camped before. I took Cooper with me and they really loved the forest. I'm not sure what it was, but I had never seen him so hyper and excited for just being able to run around and do his thing. Before it got dark, I set up a simple hut using dead trees and leaves. The ground was covered in snow from the previous night, but it wasn't that cold, so I just needed fire and a quality sleeping bag to spend the night. And of course the hut to block the wind and to reflect the heat. Around midnight, Cooper and I were enjoying the fire when suddenly he got up and began listening to the forest with his ears perked up. I couldn't hear anything, but dogs, as you know, have much better hearing than humans. So I grabbed my shotgun just in case and tried to calm him down. It took a while for Cooper to relax. I would say that he spent a good half an hour being alert and scared of something. That freaked me out a little, but that's why you carry a trusty shotgun out there, just in case there's something or someone you have to defend yourself against. I finally fell asleep at around 1 in the morning. I woke up about 2 hours later because it was freezing. When I opened my eyes, I could see that the fire had gone out. That was weird, since the firewood I used should have burned for at least 4 hours. I got up to reignite the fire, and that's when I realized that Cooper was gone. I got the flashlight out and began to inspect the nearby area. I have found something not so good. I saw footprints all around the campsite and as well as near the campfire. The footprints were definitely not made by an animal or animals for that matter. They were made by a bipedal creature, just a single creature, but they weren't human footprints. They were too narrow and long to say they belonged to a human being. Up to that point, what I deduced was that a bipedal creature had approached the campsite, put out the fire, and had taken Cooper with that. The last part was fairly clear, seeing as how the footprints leaving the campsite had both Cooper and the creature's footprints walking together towards the easterly direction of the forest. I followed the footprints and kept thinking to myself why Cooper had failed to alert me of the creature. Cooper's very attentive and vigilant. He would make a fantastic guard dog if that was his job, but that also makes him a not so good house pet if you've got kids in your household. He doesn't bite people, but it's just that he only knows his owner and that's it. The rest of the world is just a group of strangers to him. I've raised him from a tiny puppy to his 7th birthday. I know him and he would never follow a stranger, let alone a strange creature that walks on 2 legs. In any event, I have followed the footprints for about 10 minutes until I had to stop. In front of me was a lake and the footprints had stopped right at the edge of the water. That meant that Cooper either went for a swim in that temperature at that, or he had flown up to the sky after growing a miraculous pair of wings. I was devastated from the loss, but at that point, I didn't know what else to do but to turn around. I went back to the camp and made fire again. I stayed awake hoping that Cooper would come back, but I would go in search of him in the morning if it didn't. A few minutes past 5, I heard a rustling in the westerly direction. I shone the flashlight in the direction of the sound, and holy God, it was Cooper who was looking from afar. I was going to walk toward him, but something stopped me in my tracks. Something came following after Cooper. It was the bipedal creature, and no, it wasn't a human being. The thing was tall and slender. I couldn't really tell exactly how it looked, but if I had to describe the shape, imagine a human that was made out of clay and you would stretch such a person to twice his normal size. That's somewhat how the creature looked. I called for Cooper, but he just continued to stare at me and didn't move a muscle. With no other choice but to take him by force, I grabbed my shotgun and began walking towards them. That's when the creature grabbed Cooper, then began running in the opposite direction, and I quickly chased after them. It took less than a minute for me to realize that I was no match for the creature. I'm only 22 and I'm fit as a horse. I could outrun almost any civilian about my age, but that creature wasn't running. It was more like hopping a mile per stride. It was incredibly fast. I gave up and went home really sad. I thought about going back out there in search of Cooper, but a voice in my head told me that the creature isn't something I should mess with. It also told me that I was extremely lucky to have come out of bed without a scratch. I haven't gone camping ever since, but it's not because out of fear for the creature. Cooper was my best friend, my first pet ever, and I loved him very much. It's the guilt and sorrow that stops me from going back out there. I'm done with camping, and I think I'm going back to the city to forget about all this. I think that would be the best for me. I'm going to tell you something that happened to me and my family about a year ago. I currently reside in a small town in Middle America. This place has been a home to me and my family for the last 10 years. The other night, at around 10 p.m., my 2 kids were upstairs in their rooms, and my wife and I were in the living room going over our monthly budget. In the middle of our discussion about our children's college fund, the power went out and all went pitch black. We had a blackout. I tried to wake my phone up, but strangely, it didn't respond. So I said to my wife, "Honey, I think my phone's dead. Can you turn on the flashlight on yours?" Janet answered, "Mine's not turning on either." Then, as soon as my wife said that, the kids came crawling out of their rooms and both of them began to complain about the power outage and how their phones weren't working. So that's 4 phones that were out of batteries. Mind you, mine was working fine only minutes ago. I told my wife and kids to stay put and that I would go grab the flashlight from my office. I suspected that the flashlight might also not work, and unfortunately, I was right. I told my family to relax since they were starting to get worried. That was especially the case for my wife, and understandably so. It's one thing to have the power cut off, but all types of batteries getting drained at the same time is just a whole different level of weird. I should also tell you that I checked the cars as well. Both of our cars were completely out of juice. As the minutes passed, our eyes began to adjust to the darkness and we could definitely see our surroundings better. What we did next was to step out of the house, and that's because everyone in the neighborhood seemed to be doing just that. They were all in the same situation, and people tend to congregate when they are afraid. The Hart and Sanchez families were huddled together, and so we joined them in the conversation. Not a minute after we had joined them, Kelly, the Sanchez's daughter, said, "Is it just me, or is there a sound of something rumbling?" She was right. There was a low-pitched sound coming from everywhere. As the seconds ticked by, the sound was heard louder and the ground began to shake a little. It wasn't a violent shake, but rather a smooth and continuous rumble, as though you were standing on top of a gigantic electric massager. Then someone screamed, "Look up, there's something up there." Whoever that person was, he was right too. When I looked up, I saw the stars and the moon as you'd normally see when the sky is clear, but it looked unnatural. Since we were stationary and carefully observing the sky, we could tell the slight distortions around the edges of the moon and the slight light bleeds surrounding the stars. Imagine the cloaking technology in Star Trek or The Predator. Only what we saw looked far more sophisticated. Think of it this way: if all conditions were normal, and if I were doing the usual things such as jogging, driving, or even walking, I would never in a million years notice that the sky looked strange. People don't really pay much attention to the sky to begin with, but the technology that we've witnessed on that night was that good. The sky looked very close to the real thing. Having said that, it makes you wonder how big the craft must have been in order for it to have covered the entire sky from the perspective of those who are on the ground. That night, the entire neighborhood saw the cloaked UFO slowly move away from the town. As the rumbling subsided, the real moon and stars made their appearances from behind the craft. About a minute later, The power had come back. The real surprising thing from that night wasn't really the UFO. It was the scene from the next morning. As I was pulling out of my driveway, a couple of my neighbors waved at me and I waved back at them. Then, as I was driving out of the town, I saw a few people do the same and go about their day as they have all their lives. Nothing changed in the next few days, weeks, and months. We all saw what we saw that night, but we are programmed so efficiently to conform to the norm that we actually go out of our way to ignore or remove any and all that's unusual and stick to what we know and what we are comfortable with. I wasn't any different from the others. Sometimes I'd have a chance to speak to a couple of neighbors while mowing the lawn or washing the car. However, if someone brought up the craft from the other night, I felt quite uncomfortable to speak my mind on it. I've always thought that I wasn't part of the herd, the sheep, but now I'm not too sure about that.